So how much water pressure is too much water pressure? Now, I mean, like, is it 20 psi, 50 psi? Maybe it's 110 psi. Let's talk about it. Today I want to talk to you a little bit more about a story of a particular property that I was at where the pressure switch and the well system was a little bit too high for what you really want to see. This particular person's house, their water pressure would get up to 110 psi consistently. Now, before we get into why that's a problem, let's talk a little bit about how do well systems actually work, and let's decide, when does it actually turn on? What should the pressure setting actually be is determined by your pressure switch and the well system. So let's work in an order of operations here. You have your water line in, which is going to be the pipe coming through the wall from the well, and then it's going to go down to your well tank, which is going to be that big blue thing. Sometimes they're yellow, sometimes they're gray, but most of them, at least in our area, are big and blue. On the bladder tank, what you're going to see is a thing called a T-assembly. Now, what is a T-assembly? That's where when the water comes in, you're going to see a check valve, which is a little cylindrical looking deal. And then you're going to see the line go underneath of the pressure tank and into it. On that T-assembly, you're going to see four things: pressure gauge, pressure switch, hose bib, and a pressure relief valve. These are all very common and very important. Sometimes on older systems, you might be only seeing 3 of these items because for whatever reason, a lot of older houses either didn't put a hose bib or didn't put a pressure relief valve. Either way, it makes things a little bit more difficult, but this is what a modern water system looks like. So what turns on the well pump? Well, that's actually called the pressure switch. That little gray box that's sitting on top of the T-assembly is the control panel for the system. And for lack of better terms, it's not the technical control panel, but it's the pressure switch. It's what turned the well pump on and off. How this works is once you have water coming into the house through the water line, there's going to be a little nipple underneath of it that the water goes up into the switch. From there, there's going to be a little spring right in the back of it that is going to be controlling your pressure setting. Now, to figure out the pressure setting, what you need to do is you need to look underneath of the lid to the pressure switch, that little gray cover. Sometimes they're black, but most of the time they're gray. And then underneath of that, we'll have a sticker that'll tell you what is my pressure supposed to be. Generally speaking, most of these systems have a 20-point swing. So you'll have one that starts at 30 psi and then one that finishes at 50 psi, or it'll be 20-40, 40-60, somewhere in that ballpark. But most systems nowadays are going to be a 40-60 switch. So what does that mean? When the air pressure in the tank drops to 40 psi, you're going to hear a click sound as that switch turns on, and then pump, 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 and then the water will continue to flow, compressing the air in the tank until you get to 60 psi, to which point you hear the click again, and the pump is off. That force is stored as pneumatic energy in the top of the tank, which then, as you turn on a faucet, sink, bathtub, whatever, you'll see the water flow out of the well tank and through the rest of the home. The pump will not be running until you get to 40 psi, and then the whole process starts over again. So the water will constantly be up and down, depending on the demand. Now, there are other types of systems called constant pressure systems, or basically the better way to think about this is on-demand use. So when you have that type of system, essentially as soon as you turn on the kitchen sink, the pump will engage and it will supply the pressure to your house. The type of system that we're talking about is a traditional one, which is not this. So that's a conversation for a whole different day. Today, we're looking at pressure tanks with pressure switches, the old school stuff. Now that we got the history out of the way, I think we can get more into the weeds with the details of what actually happened on this particular inspection with this particular property, and why is it so dangerous to have 100 psi plus in your water piping. When it comes to public water, generally you end up having a minorly higher water pressure consistently throughout the house. It's just because the city's going to have more oomph behind the water they're supplying to you. When you have a private residential well, that's not always the case. A lot of times you're going to end up with pressure that's going to be 60 psi or less on your system. The reason for this is that most systems, like we discussed, are going to be a 40-60 switch. So obviously the max amount of pressure you're going to receive is 60 psi. Sometimes we can have an issue with the switch. Now in this particular circumstance, what was going on was we had the pressure switch would turn on at 10 psi. It would pump all the way up until 110 plus psi. A lot of times you had to physically push the contact plates off of the pressure switch so that way it would actually disengage and stop pumping water. This is incredibly dangerous. What can happen is if that pump keeps pumping water in, you can damage the pump, you can damage the piping, you can damage the fittings, you could also damage your water heater, you can damage the faucets. There's a lot of things that you can have go wrong if the pressure's too high. When you have a public water system, most of the times they're gonna have 68 PSI-ish, maybe 70, 75 PSI-ish. If your pressure is coming in too much, a lot of public systems, like mine, for example, will have a pressure reducing valve to basically knock that pressure that's coming in at a high pressure, knock it down so that way the pressure throughout the house is a more manageable, normal pressure. When it comes to public water, it's a lot harder for you to know what your pressure is unless you have a pressure gauge installed before and after your pressure reducing valve. That's pretty high tech, and most public water systems, you're not gonna see that. You might see one every now and again, especially if like the homeowner's an engineer. They're pretty cool. I do think it's fun to have those installed, but most of the time you're not gonna see that. On a well system though, for a private residential water system, you will see a pressure gauge, at least one in the house. A lot of times you'll see people put one at the tank, and then they'll put one after the water treatment. So that way you can make sure that if there's any kind of loss of pressure, you can identify, is it because of what's coming in, or is it because of the filtration that you have in your particular house? With a water system on a private well, a lot of times you can adjust the pressure to whatever you want. So in this particular circumstance, we have an issue with the pressure switch itself producing too much pressure in the house. The reason for this is because the spring in the pressure switch is no longer working the way that it's supposed to work. Now, what are some of the problems that can come from this? Well, if you don't do anything about it, obviously you can, again, damage your piping. But we've already had a few problems with this because the homeowner didn't know that his pressure was basically not in compliance. He did notice that the pressure was kind of weird, where it would like drop down to almost nothing, then it would surge really good, and then it would go all the way back down to nothing. And this has been going on for a month or two. And it wasn't until we were testing the water that we're like, hey, something's going on here. You might want to look into what's happening. That's why it's important to make sure whenever you're having your water tested, just that guy's got to look at the equipment in your basement to make sure that there's nothing silly happening. And maybe even though they're not fixing it, like I'm not fixing it, I'm telling you, hey, you got a problem, you should look into how to fix it. The other issue that we have with this is that the safety function, the pressure relief valve, did not discharge. Most of these valves will generally discharge between 75 and 95 PSI. Remember, we were at 110 and it didn't go off. Along with this, we also noticed that the interior of the pressure tank, there was no air pressure for the pre-charge. What does that mean, you might be asking? What happens when you have no air pressure or too high of pressure in the pressure tank is you run the risk of that bladder rupturing. So I think what we had happen was we had a failure at the pressure switch, which ruined the spring and basically made it to where the pump would overcycle. And then because of that, we identified a defect in the pressure relief valve because that wasn't going off. And we also had a problem where because that excessive pressure and a 30-year-old pressure tank, the bladder itself had ruptured too, to where now the tank was waterlogged. The cause of our issues was the switch itself. What is the rectification for this? Generally speaking, if you have a problem with the switch, what you're gonna need to do is take off the old switch and put a new switch on. That'll fix a lot of the problems. Now, in this particular circumstance, that's not going to be the solution because we have bigger issues that need to be addressed. The larger issue that's going to need to be addressed is going to be the tank and the T-assembly, because those also are not doing what they're supposed to do. A lot of times when you have a 30-year-old T-assembly, you probably won't be able to unscrew the fittings that are already there, so that pressure relief valve and the pressure switch, you might be able to get off, but I've pulled a lot of them off and it just snaps, and then now you got to either extract the piece that's remaining or you just end up replacing the whole thing anyway. So generally what I recommend to people is if you've got a 30-year-old system, if you have to replace that one part, it's at least worth thinking about replacing the whole system. The lesson to be learned from this whole situation is that if you start to notice something weird going on with the pressure in your house, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and investigate a little bit further. maybe you might want to have somebody who knows a little bit more about the system come take a look at it and walk you through what might actually be going on and advise you on what to do, so that way you don't end up having a blown pipe, blown fitting, blown out pressure tank, bad water heater, issues with your faucets, and in this circumstance, breaking your pressure tank because of this high pressure. All of this stuff can be fixed, but this guy's incredibly lucky that he didn't have a big problem, especially with a lot of his memorabilia and sentimental things was in the same utility room that the pressure tank was in. If you have any sentimental stuff, do not put it in the same room as your water heater, your sump pump, or even your pressure tank, because if that thing goes, you're gonna lose a lot of cherished memories. Not a good idea. If you gained any value out of this story, I try to bring things that I see in my life to you, so that way you can help inform yourself more on the systems in your home. If you gained value out of that, hit that like button, hit subscribe. I have videos posted every day covering all different types of topics, whether it's a well, a septic system, home repair, a DIY project. I'm gonna bring you with me as we fix some stuff on the house. I'm gonna show you ways that I'm saving money, ways that you might be able to save money, all sorts of really cool things that we're trying to get done over here. And I wanna bring you with me. So hit that like button, hit subscribe, and I look forward to talking to you guys tomorrow.